What you have to do, and what is easier said than done, is you have to keep always in mind, as it were, the geomorphology of the landscape. So that then brings me to something we have in the UK that not everybody is aware of, which are protocols for science advice and policy making, which were actually put down by the John Major government just before it got voted out. It was just in the last months, but then promptly reaffirmed by Tony Blair. And they broadly say sort of sensible things. I mean, they say you should be trying to think ahead. Well, that's easier said than done. But when you do come to an issue, such as the things I've alluded to earlier, you should, in the early stages, consult widely and deliberately solicit dissent. You should make sure that the people who are going to not agree with you are included and their views are put in early. You shouldn't exclude anybody because they have identifiable interests. Because most people will have interests of one sort or another. You don't exclude them, but you should clearly identify and keep in mind the interests. Most importantly, you should identify and make clear and keep making clear if there's a tendency on the part of political expedients to want to turn the uncertainties into something different. You should identify and acknowledge the uncertainties. You should try, while recognising the risks, to manage them in a common sense way that is proportional. And in all this, you should avoid getting a group of experts in a room to give confidential advice to a minister. You should publish the advice. You should do it openly. These things were put forward then. They were reviewed again in 2000, and there have been subsequent reviews and reaffirmations. Each one, I should say, getting longer. The first one was about 4 pages, and this one was a bit fatter, and by this time they're a book about that thick. But there you are. I should mention the motive for this in the first instance, and this is a personal note, was BSE. On my watch, I mean, the initial thing was a report led by Richard Southwood on will BSE, is it likely to hop into humans and cause a problem? The report very sensibly said, well, we don't know, but by analogy with scrapian sheep, which has been round for centuries, and there is no sign that it's ever had any ill effect on humans, the best guess is it won't. That's what the report said. But that was quickly transmogrified into the luckless John Gummer wishing to reassure people, feeding his daughter a hamburger on television. That all happened before my watch, but it was on my watch that we discovered that the unlikely had happened and the best guess was wrong. And it was prompted not by Jack Lewis, but by another person like him. It was Brian Flowers, who rang me. And Brian Flowers has been one of my mentors from early days. He's one of my intellectual uncles. He was in graduate school with one of my advisors. And he rang and said, don't you think it'd be a good idea to have, this is my recollection, he forgets it, but I remember it. Don't you think it'd be a good idea to have some sort of thing? And that's why we produced these guidelines. And they have subsequently become not only revised and so on, but they've led under David King and now continuing under John Beddington to a more widespread practice in individual departments bringing in outsiders who are insiders. And I'll say a little bit more about that toward the end. There were also the Phillips inquiry into BSE, which produced strong recommendations along the same lines as the protocols. It was fully aware of the protocols, but it didn't emphasise them, understandably. It was, after all, spending $30 million, taking 3 years and producing a huge shelf of books. It didn't want to make it too clear that some of the things had been said before. And it had a wonderfully engaging, concrete example of how difficult it is to follow that advice. Because one of the 3 people on the Phillips inquiry was firmly wedded to the idea that the origin of the BSE was a spontaneous mutation in the British cattle herd, and then amplified by feeding processes. That could be right. We don't really know yet for sure, but it's not the mainstream opinion. But here was the Phillips report in all its... It's a good report, but it emphasises again and again, you've got to admit the uncertainties, but it says there's an apodictic certitude. BSE came from a spontaneous mutation in the British herd. It really is a beautiful example of how hard it is to recognise what you don't know once you think you know, when you don't really know. And it was also reaffirmed in an interesting House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee chaired by Patrick Jenkin, himself an interesting person. One of his ancestors was the person in Darwin's year who drew to Darwin's attention the huge problem of maintaining variability in populations under the then prevalent notion of blending inheritance. Fleming Jenkin was one of the people that Darwin had to just choose to ignore because the phenomenon was real, even if the science of the day couldn't explain it. And that committee also affirmed these general principles with a nod in the direction that they were already embedded in government policy. However, embedded in government policy is one thing, but executing them is not so easy. And here are some of the problems in executing them, and I'll discuss them first in the abstract and then with some illustrative anecdotes. First, it's all very well to say, get together a group and make clear what we know and what we don't know, but for one thing, many of those who will come to participate in the consultative process may in reality be bringing quite different agendas to the debate, like actors appearing on stage in disguise. So that what should be a discussion about openly acknowledged, value-driven decisions, guided and constrained by our best understanding of the relevant scientific facts and uncertainties, get turned into something more like the adversarial games of the courtroom, with the science deliberately coloured or selectively presented or even misrepresented in pursuit of some larger, but not openly acknowledged, ideological crusade. All with the best of intention. And you can think for yourselves of many examples of this. That doesn't mean that the ideologues should not be heard. They will be heard. They should be included. Their views should be heard. But one should try and make... The real challenge is to paint the emergent scientific landscape in all its uncertainties, all be open about the relevant hillocks and peaks, against the background of experimental facts and uncertainties of various kinds, so that the open-minded participants in the debate can clearly appreciate what we do and do not know. And that, as I keep saying, is more easily said than done. It's further compounded, the task of conveying this, and this is not to demonise the media for a moment, but the problems are in fact compounded by the fact that in the resulting tumult of voices, the media, whether it's print or radio or TV, are often unhelpful for two reasons. The first reason, it really has to be understood. Their primary aim, which is not unreasonable, is to get your attention, to be the people you listen to or watch or read. And if they don't do that successfully, then it doesn't matter what they print because you won't read it. But it's only secondarily that they aim actually to inform you. And to different degrees, the different shades of journalism and television and radio try to match the informing to the engaging you with more sincerity than others.